Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Vlogitas. I'm Ramsey, and together we go through the Bible, basically chapter and verse. I'll just reiterate quickly, this kind of came about simply because people asked us why our kids love the Lord, and, even though that they're almost grown, they still, they read the Bible every day. They love the Lord. Well, why? Well, because we fostered a love for the Word when they were young. We went through the Word, basically how I'm doing now. They knew that they were allowed to ask questions. In fact, you may hear, every now and then you hear the occasional question on Vlogitas from somebody who happens to be behind the camera, and that's fine, and I answer the question if I can. If I don't know the answer, I say, I don't know. Anyhow, so here we are in the book of Exodus, and we are in we're going to be looking at chapters 21, 22, and 23. Hopefully, we may get that far. We may not. If not, no big deal. I had debated whether or not to do chapters 21 and 22. Actually, those are highlighted out, not to for the younger age. We talked about that in the very beginning. Some of you may remember where we I have it highlighted out according to age, because since the Bible is complicated and there's some things that we don't discuss with our young ones, just because some of it is very adult. It had to be, because this is God giving an account of things that happened. He wasn't necessarily in agreement with a lot of stuff that happened, but he's just keeping an account and letting us know. So anyway, because of this chapter, these God, if you remember the last time that we did this, we looked at Exodus 20, where God gives the 10 commandments, and those are the main commandments. Now He's going to give a bunch of community commandments among the people, and essentially all of the commandments, at the root of them is do no harm. Do no harm. And now this here is going to give us, we're going to open up chapter 21. It's going to give us some fair treatment of slaves, and I thought, well, don't necessarily want to get into all that, but we will, simply because the concept of slavery is ancient, and it's simply because in the ancient world there was no credit card companies, there was no tax collection agents, or there was no collection agencies that could get after you and get you to pay back what you owe. So if you got yourself into debt, the only way to work your way out of debt was to become a slave. And so this was not just a physical exodus from Egypt. God was also getting them, showing them how to exit a mindset. And the mindset that was put upon them in Egypt was that if you're a slave for life, and you're treated however your master wants to treat you. But God gave them very specific instructions about how you treat slaves. And we're going to see God was very fair. Now, according to God's system, if the people did everything that God said, they would be so blessed that no one would ever have to get into debt. But God knew that there's going to be some people who don't handle their finances well, or maybe they just wouldn't obey Him, and so they would end up having to be in debt. And so let's go ahead and look here in Exodus chapter 21. It says, "These are the regulations you must present to Israel. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he may serve for no more than 6 years. Set him free in the 7th year, and he will owe you nothing for his freedom. If he was single when he became your slave, he shall leave single. But if he was married before he became a slave, then his wife must be freed with him. If his master gave him a wife while he was a slave, and they had sons or daughters, then only the man will be set free in the 7th year, but his wife and children will still belong to his master." Well, that's because it had to do with how ownership worked. Remember back in the book of Genesis, God said, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." So since the two are no longer two but one, if they were two before he got married, then they're one flesh. If they were one before he became a slave, that's what I meant to say. They get married, he becomes a slave, he mishandles his finances, he doesn't obey the word of the Lord, ends up a pauper, or in debt has to go into slavery. If he was married before that happened, then his wife was one flesh together with him. Therefore, at the end of that slavery term, the 6 years, then they would go free because she is the same flesh as him. But it gets more complicated if they get married while he's a slave. And so God is giving directions now. And God is also telling us here in the underlying, in the undercurrent of what's being spoken, that masters are to treat their slaves very well, because he says here in verse 5, but the slave may declare, I love my master, my wife and my children, I don't want to go free. If he does this, his master must present him before God. Then his master must take him to the door or doorpost and publicly pierce his ear with an awl. After that, the slave will serve his master for life. There was a permanent sign of slavery then, to pierce the ear. They probably had an earring to indicate. Verse 7, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she will not be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are. If she does not satisfy her owner, he must allow her to be bought back again. But he is not allowed to sell her to foreigners, since he is the one who broke the contract with her. The contract is with her. But if the slave's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a slave, but as a daughter. If a man who has married a slave wife takes another wife for himself, he must not neglect the rights of the first wife to food, clothing, and husband and wife things. The Bible doesn't exactly say that there, but I have that marked, at the end of the thing. And so that's an example of how, as a parent, if you are a parent and you're reading the Bible to your children, you might want to change the verbiage just slightly, and just kind of explain. Like I could say, well, I'm gonna, like later on down in verse 20. I have verse 20 and 21 marked out in this chapter, and I will just kind of give an overview. I'm not going to get into it and just say, well, that's something that I could teach on, but I will not, because my intention is not to get extremely deep, but to just give general knowledge and just kind of come through here, because the idea is not to get into a word study or something like that. The idea is to bring up our general knowledge of the word, just so that we feel more familiar with it, we feel more comfortable with it, and that we're able to speak on it with some authority, is the idea. Okay, so, the idea of Vlogitas, anyway. So, verse 11, and still talking about this issue of a slave wife. If he fails in any of these 3 obligations, she may leave as a free woman without making any payment. And that is unheard. That right there, it was unheard of in the ancient world. God is giving some rules that other nations would say, that's ridiculous. Once they're a slave for life. They're my property. I can treat them however I want. God's saying you cannot treat a slave just however you want. Is what God is saying. And God is saying if you do not treat them fairly, then they're going to be able to go free. And so that gave them incentive to really treat people right. Because again, what is the underlying message of all of these commandments that God is giving to people? Do no harm. Do no harm. Okay, so coming down here to verse 12. Anyone who assaults and kills another person must be put to death. But if it was simply an accident permitted by God, I will appoint a place of refuge where the slayer can run for safety. Well, now why would God permit that? Well, God permitted Cain to kill Abel. See, because this issue of free will comes in. And someone might say, well, how come God doesn't protect people? He does. There are times when he protects people from death, many times. And if he permits it, it's for his own good reasons. There's a lot that goes into a person's will, a person's free will, and how God conducts things so that in the end he will come out as the just judge. It's like I told people one time, when I was pastoring, it's like you pray. If I pray and I ask God for something, if no person is involved, if I'm asking God to, for something that only affects me, then only my own will comes into play. But if I'm asking God for something for somebody else, then there's already at least one more will in play. And so we a lot of times think, well, God's taking forever to take care of this thing. But what we can't see is the spiritual issues that are bound up in people's will. And so it's like we ask God to do this one thing. If we're asking in line with his will and we ask in faith, he'll see to it. But at the same time, we can't see, okay, well, there's 5 other people's will involved in here that we don't see, so he's got to work on this, and then he's got to work on this, and then he's got to work on this, and then he's got to work on this. And so we don't see all the things that God works out on our behalf when we ask him for something. And so we need to understand that. And so we can't be so quick to judge God and say, well, God shouldn't have allowed that. Well, how do you really know? How do you really know? You know, that's really the question. And so we should always be giving God the benefit of the doubt, since he's the one that sent Jesus to die for our sins. Amen. So, down here, sometimes there's an accident, someone dies. And so God, and you'll see this later on, he goes into great detail about the cities of refuge. There was a place that the person could run to for shelter until until the court could make a determination on the case to find out if it really was. See, because God instituted this whole thing where he instituted the punishment of death for murder, the crime of murder, back, with Noah. And see, God is continuing that law here into the covenant he's making with Israel. And so there are cases where it's not clear whether it was really murder or not, because people make a mistake a lot of times, because the translators in ancient, in England, when they were where most of the translations came from, and people look at maybe the old King James Version and they say, well, the Bible just says thou shalt not kill. No, the Bible makes a distinction between killing and murder. Those are 2 different things. And so there were some cases where God allowed killing, he never allowed murder. And so, because we could look back and say, just right when God made that law, right after Noah exited the ark, God said, anyone who commits murder, their life must be, if they take a human life, their life must be taken by human hands. And so, if the person who had to carry out the punishment against the person who committed murder, if murdering that person was, or if executing that person was considered murder, then God would be saying, well, then we got to kill this one too. And now, because somebody else killed this one, that's also murder, so now we got to kill that one. And it would just be an ongoing problem. And so, in this particular case, God is saying not all, if a person being killed by another person is not always murder. And so, if that was the case, if all killing was murder, then God's people would not have been allowed to protect themselves. So here we go. Verse 14, however, if someone deliberately kills another person, then the slayer must be dragged even from my altar and be put to death. The people would go, when they were afraid of a punishment, they would go to the altar, and they would grab the horns of the altar. There was 4 horns that came out of the 4 corners of the altar. And they would grab a hold of the horns of the altar, because it was like pleading mercy, and God's saying, no, if it's obvious that they killed this person, that's not even going to help them. Verse 15, anyone who strikes father or mother must be put to death. And I'm going to go ahead and skip 16, I'll just point out that this is actually something that God had in place. Our government doesn't necessarily follow that, but you can do some study on it yourself. And so then verse 17, anyone who dishonors father or mother must be put to death. Now, I went ahead and addressed that simply because Jesus brought that up himself in the New Testament. And so it's a key verse. Now, verse 18, now suppose 2 men quarrel, and one hits the other with a stone or fist. If the injured person does not die, but is confined, and the injured person does not die, but is confined to bed. If he is later able to walk outside again, even with a crutch, the assailant will not be punished, but must compensate his victim for lost wages and provide for his full recovery. See, again, God is like, be very careful how you treat people. Don't just let your anger take hold of you and strike somebody just because you're angry, because of what the laws that God is putting in place here. He's like, if you injure a person so bad that they can never work again, he's saying you have to compensate them for their wage. In other words, you have to pay their wage for the rest of their life. And so what is the solution? God is saying, don't do any harm, so that you don't have to do that, right? Okay, so again, skipping verse 20 and 21, now down to 22. Now suppose two men are fighting, and in the process they accidentally strike a pregnant woman, so she gives birth prematurely. If no further injury results, the man who struck the woman must pay the amount of compensation the woman's husband demands, and the judges approve. So what is this? This is probably the earliest form that we see of a modern day court case. I mean, this is the kind of thing that somebody, you look at claims court. Someone comes in and says, this person wronged me in this way, and therefore I am suing them for this amount of compensation. And then the judge looks at the evidence and considers it and then makes a judgment. Verse 23, if there is further injury, this is still talking about the pregnant woman, the punishment must match the injury. A life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. So in this case, because of the people are supposed to respect God, they're supposed to say, I should cause no harm because there will be even restitution back. But now Jesus quoted this very verse when he's like, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, so Jesus implemented forgiveness. Not that God the Father didn't have that included in here. It's just that for that time and that place and that dispensation, God was saying, if you do this, the result will be righteous conduct. And so this is why God instituted this. And so remember I talked to you before about dispensations, and people can think, well, now you're getting over into really complicated stuff. Not really, not if you think about it in terms of a Pez dispenser, because that's just a little toy that you press the thing and it dispenses Pez, right? So what is God, if you imagine God with a Pez dispenser, in what age, what is God dispensing at that time? In this age, in this time, God is dispensing these rules. But then when Jesus came on the scene and fulfilled the law, and therefore he could dictate what the people had to keep from then on out, he is free to dispense whatever he wants to dispense, because he's the author and the finisher of our faith. Okay, so now down to verse 26. If a man hits a male or female slave in the eye, and the eye is blinded, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And if a man knocks out the tooth of his male or female slave, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. What's God saying? You have to treat people right. You have to, even if they're a slave, you have to treat them right. If you hit them in the eye and you blind them, you have to let them go free. If you knock out a tooth, you have to let them go free. So what is God saying? Don't hit your slave. Don't risk blinding him or knocking out their tooth. Don't do that. Don't hit a slave. Verse 28, if an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox must be stoned, and its flesh may not be eaten. Now, I got to stop here for a second, because I've talked with the kids about this before. It's like, you imagine how many stones it would take to kill an ox? How long do we have to, you take the entire village to keep throwing stones at the ox until the ox dies. What are people supposed to do? They're supposed to maintain their household well. They're supposed to manage their household well and make sure that their ox is not put in a position where it can gore anybody. In such a case, however, the owner will not be held liable, because it's a first-time offense. Look down, verse 29. But suppose the ox had a reputation for goring, and the owner had been informed, but failed to keep it under control. If the ox then kills someone, it must be stoned, and the owner must also be put to death. Why? Because he caused the death of somebody because he failed to recognize this animal is a dangerous animal, and he failed to do anything about it. We have similar. We don't have such an extreme punishment these days, but if you can be involved in a court case because somebody sues you, and if they say, I read about it when I was pastoring a church. In a church setting, if somebody trips on a mat or something and they sue the church, and the first thing they're going to ask is, did you know that the mat was a problem? Did nobody take time to actually fix this mat? And if you did you take reasonable steps to ensure that mat was secured properly? That's all the things that they're going to ask. And in this case, it's very similar. Did this person make sure that ox was... And it may seem like kind of random and say, why are we only talking about an ox? Well, obviously that's going to apply to all livestock across the board, because God's just giving an example to follow. Okay, so Verse 30, so the ox must be put to death. Verse 30, however, the dead person's relatives may accept payment to compensate for the loss of life. The owner of the ox may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. The same regulation applies if the ox gores a boy or a girl. But if the ox gores a slave, either male or female, the animal's owner must pay the slave's owner 30 silver coins, and the ox must be stoned. And, this is interesting because 30 silver coins was that was the accepted price for a slave. And again, if the person was a slave and you got to the end of the 7 years and you were an Israelite, you went free anyway. But this cost stays the same for that entire time period. But then what's interesting is that Jesus was betrayed for 30 silver coins, and that was the price that the Pharisees valued his life at. So this is kind of deep, But then, by the same token, if a person had a foreigner as a slave, the foreigner stayed a slave for their entire life, except in the case where a foreigner became an Israelite, because God already made it clear that any foreigner could become an Israelite. And so if they became a Jew, then at the end of that 6-year period, they went free. And so, if you consider, and even a nominal Jew, somebody who just went through the steps of doing, they just went through the steps of becoming a Jew just so they could go free, they could do that. So that means any slaves that were taken from foreign nations that the Israelites invaded, or anybody who attacked them and they took them prisoner and they made them a slave, if they became an Israelite at the end of that 7 years, guess what? They could go free. So now, and that was unheard of in other nations. Once you were a slave for life. But not in God's camp. Not in God's camp. Verse 33. And again, it's like, seems like maybe someone's struggling with that in their heart, because that came up again. Someone may be asking, why? Well, but why would God allow slavery at all? We have to look at things from God's perspective. We can't look at things from this modern perspective, because once again, in the ancient world, there was no other way to pay off a debt. No other way. Just have to keep that in mind. And so, even though God did not like the practice of slavery, he allowed it in the case of a person who could not pay off a debt, and he gave them specific instructions and told them, if you follow my commands, I'll bless you so much that you'll never ever have to get in such a financial state that you'll have to sell yourself as a slave. So if the people in covenant with God would follow God's ways, they never would have had to do that. But he knows that there's people that aren't going to, 1, obey him, and 2, even if they do obey him, maybe they choose not to be good with money. Alright, so, now down into verse 33. Suppose someone digs or uncovers a pit and fails to cover it, and then an ox or a donkey falls into it. The owner of the pit must pay full compensation to the owner of the animal, but then he gets to keep the dead animal. Look at how God is such a genius. The person, first of all, if they dig a hole or they dig a pit, they should manage that well. But if they fail to manage it, and an ox or a donkey, an animal, falls into it and then dies, they have to pay, because they were the ones who were negligent. They have to pay for the loss of the animal, but they get to keep the animal, because even though it's dead, it still has some value. Not as much value as a live animal, obviously, but it still has meat, it still has hide. There's still some value to it. Now, verse 35. If someone's ox injures a neighbor's ox, and the injured ox dies, then the two owners must sell the live ox and divide the price equally between them. They must also divide the dead animal. But if the ox had a reputation for goring, yet its owner failed to keep it under control, he must pay full compensation, a live ox for the dead one. But he may keep the dead ox, again, because the dead ox has some value, but not as much value as a live ox. So even though he failed to do what he should and keep his animal under control, and as a result it kills another animal, he has to pay the full price of the live animal, which is more worth than the dead animal, but he gets to keep the dead animal. So God is such a genius.